It started with a knock, except it wasn't from a person. On a freezing night, an old man opened his door, and there was a wounded dog staring up at him like it had nowhere else to go. What followed wasn't just a rescue, it was the beginning of something neither of them expected. If you've ever believed that animals find us when we need them most, please hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. This story might stay in your heart longer than you think. Snow had swallowed the entire town of Northwood, Vermont, a small, forest-fringed community that often disappeared under white silence every winter. That night, the storm was relentless. Wind roared like wolves through the pine trees, and snowflakes thick as feathers slashed sideways through the air. The remote mountain road leading to Caleb Moore's cabin had long vanished beneath the drifts. The nearest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away. His cabin stood alone, like a stubborn ember refusing to die in the wilderness. Inside, the only light came from the flickering fire in a stone hearth. Caleb Moore, a tall and broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, sat slumped in a threadbare armchair, the light etching deep lines into his sun-damaged face. His once black beard had turned mostly silver, and his shoulders had a permanent droop, as though burdened by memories too heavy to set down. He wore a thick wool sweater with a frayed collar, and a green beanie pulled low over his forehead. His eyes, a muted blue, were fixed on the fire, unfocused. Caleb had once been a renowned wood sculptor whose works were displayed in galleries across New England. But everything changed the night a black car pulled up to his Boston home with 2 soldiers and a folded flag. His son, Daniel, his only child, had been killed in action in Syria. Caleb left everything behind afterward, his work, his city, and his wife's ghost, retreating to the cabin Daniel helped him build in Vermont. That was 2 years ago. Since then, the fire had become his only audience. Then came the sound, a faint, persistent scratching. Caleb blinked and sat up slowly. He heard it again. It wasn't the groaning of trees or the scurry of a raccoon. It was deliberate, fragile-like the last effort of something too weak to try again. He grabbed his lantern from the hook by the door and cracked it open, instantly stung by the blizzard's bite. His boots crunched forward, and the light cut into the swirl of snow. There, just beyond the porch, was a shape, a mound of dark fur moving weakly against the wind. Caleb's breath caught. At first glance he thought it was a wolf, but the shape didn't match the wild, lean outline. As he stepped closer, he realized it was a dog, a German shepherd, large but thin, its fur soaked and clumped with frost. The dog lay on its side, one front paw stretched out at an odd angle. Blood had seeped into the snow beneath it, forming a stark crimson halo. The dog's eyes met his deep, amber, and filled with exhaustion. There was no growl, no fear, no sign of aggression, only pain and something eerily close to resignation. Caleb hesitated. Every instinct told him to back away. This was a wild animal, hurt and unpredictable. But then he saw it, the silver glint of a broken collar around its neck. It wasn't wild. It had belonged to someone. Maybe it had once belonged to someone like Daniel. He knelt slowly in the snow, extending a gloved hand. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. The dog flinched, then settled again, too weak to move. Caleb took off his coat and draped it over the animal's back, surprised at how cold it felt through the fabric. With some effort, he lifted the dog into his arms. It was heavy, all muscle under the emaciation, and Caleb's joints protested the weight, but he gritted his teeth and carried it inside. The warmth hit them like a tide. The dog groaned softly as Caleb laid it on an old woven rug by the fire. His hands trembled as he fetched towels, warm water, and the dusty first aid kit from beneath the sink. The wound on the dog's leg was jagged, torn open by something sharp glass, metal, maybe wire. The edges had begun to blacken with frostbite. Caleb had seen similar wounds in Daniel's childhood dog, Max, once after a hunting accident. The memory surged unbidden. Daniel at 10, sobbing into Max's fur. Caleb stitching a gash while reassuring them both everything would be fine. Back in the present, Caleb worked in silence. He cleaned the wound, sterilized it with alcohol, and wrapped the leg in layers of gauze and cotton. The dog whimpered once but didn't resist. It trusted him. Or maybe it was too far gone to care. Afterward, he placed a shallow dish of water near its snout and added a spoonful of canned chicken to a bowl. The dog sniffed the food, licked it once, and rested its head on its paws. Caleb sighed. He reached for a thick woolen blanket and covered the dog, then sank back into his chair. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moaned like a lost soul. Inside, something shifted in the air, not just the scent of wet fur and antiseptic, but something deeper, older, as if the cabin had been holding its breath for years and had finally exhaled. Caleb didn't know the dog's story, but he had a feeling the two of them weren't so different, both bruised by loss, both looking for shelter in the storm. He stared into the fire, eyes heavy, his mind finally quiet. The sun rose slow and reluctant over the white hills of Northwood, its pale light filtering through the frost-bitten window panes of Caleb's cabin. The storm had passed, but the world remained frozen still, muffled and brilliant with snow. Inside, the fire had dulled to glowing embers. Caleb stirred in his armchair, his back aching from the awkward position he'd slept in. The dog, still asleep by the hearth, had not moved much since the night before. Caleb pushed himself up with a groan, then knelt beside the animal. The dog's breathing was steady but shallow. He gently pulled back the woolen blanket and unwrapped the dressing around its injured leg. The wound looked worse in daylight, a long gash with bruised edges and older scarring nearby. Caleb frowned. This wasn't just a single injury. Beneath the main wound were scratches, scabs, and patches of missing fur. Some injuries were healing, others raw. It looked like the dog had either been abused or fought its way through something brutal. He murmured softly, "What happened to you, boy?" The dog opened its eyes slowly, amber irises catching the morning light. Caleb hesitated. "Guess I need to call you something," he said, studying the creature. "You look like a Hank to me." The dog didn't react, but Caleb nodded as if confirming a silent agreement. "Hank it is." He cleaned the wound again, this time more thoroughly, applying antibiotic ointment and a tighter wrap. Hank whimpered softly, but did not struggle. Caleb took that as trust or exhaustion. As he worked, memories surfaced. Max, Daniel's dog, had once sliced his paw on a fishing trip near Lake Champlain. Daniel had cried while Caleb wrapped the wound, swearing they should take Max to the vet immediately. Caleb had insisted on treating it himself. That had been the beginning of Daniel's fascination with animals. He had once planned to become a vet before choosing the army. Caleb blinked the memory away. Later that morning, Caleb was ladling lentil stew into a pot when he heard soft footsteps crunching through snow. He paused, then smiled faintly. There was only one person who ever walked through that snow willingly to reach his door. A knock followed, tentative but rhythmic. "Mr. Moore, I brought that carrot soup I promised." He opened the door to a burst of cold and the bright face of Eliza. Eliza Monroe was 11, small and full of wiry energy, with wild auburn curls always escaping the knitted hat she wore crookedly over one ear. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, and she carried a thermos in one hand, a sketchbook clutched to her chest in the other. She was the daughter of his nearest neighbors, the Monroes, who ran the seasonal maple syrup stand on Route 6. Unlike her older brothers, who rarely acknowledged Caleb, Eliza had taken an unlikely interest in him after spotting his wood sculptures through a window the previous spring. She had since made a habit of dropping by once every week with soup and new drawings. She was bold but never rude, always chatting, but somehow not exhausting. Caleb, despite himself, had grown fond of her visits. "Don't leave the door open too long, or you'll let all the warm out," she teased, stepping inside without waiting. Her eyes immediately fell to the rug by the fire. "Whoa!" The sketchbook lowered. She stared at Hank. "Is that a real German shepherd? Like, the army kind?" Caleb nodded. "Found him outside during the storm, or maybe he found me." "He looks like he's been through a war," she said softly, moving closer with surprising gentleness for someone usually in constant motion. "Maybe he has," Caleb said, pouring some soup into a bowl. Eliza crouched down beside Hank, who opened one eye to glance at her. "What's his name?" "I've been calling him Hank," Caleb replied. "He hasn't argued." Eliza grinned. "He looks like a Hank. Can I draw him?" "You brought that sketchbook all this way. Might as well." She pulled off her gloves and opened her book to a blank page. Her hands, though small, moved with precision and focus. She glanced up at the dog every few seconds, her brows knitting together. "He's got one ear that leans a little more, and his left eye's got a scar just above it." "Sharp eyes," Caleb said, surprised. "I want to be an animal illustrator," she said matter-of-factly. "Like draw for rescue shelters, adoption posters. Animals need good portraits too, you know." Caleb smiled. I didn't know that, but you're right. For the next half hour, they worked in silence. Caleb cleaned up the stew, prepared a small portion for Hank, who still refused to eat, and made a cup of coffee. Eliza kept sketching, only pausing to peer closer at Hank's paws or the way his tail curled around his legs. Do you think he had an owner? She asked eventually. I don't know, Caleb answered, but someone wasn't kind to him. Eliza didn't speak for a while. Then she said, my friend Lena had a dog that got taken by a man who ran a bad shelter. He tied them up with chains. When she found her dog again, he had a scar just like Hank's. Caleb looked over at her. That's awful. She cried so hard she couldn't even hug him at first, Eliza whispered. I think he forgave her, though. The room fell into a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, the sky had turned from gray to eggshell blue. The storm had left a glistening sheen on the trees. Hank finally stirred and shifted slightly toward the fire. His eyes followed Eliza's pencil with curiosity. He's watching me, she said with a smile. Maybe he likes being drawn. I'll come back tomorrow, she said, standing up and stretching. I want to draw him again, and I'll bring chicken soup. Dogs like chicken, right? I think they do, Caleb replied. As she bundled up again and stepped toward the door, she paused. Hey, Mr. Moore, I think you're different now. You used to always look kind of hollow. You don't today. Caleb blinked. That so? She nodded. Maybe it's Hank, or maybe it's you. Bye. And with that, she disappeared into the snow again. Caleb watched her go until the woods swallowed her. He turned back to the fire. Hank's breathing was deeper now. The cabin felt warmer, not from the fire, but from the strange company of a wounded dog and a girl with a sketchbook. The morning broke sharp and brittle, the sun reflecting off snow-crusted branches like scattered shards of glass. Caleb Moore was already awake. He had been sitting at the kitchen table since before dawn, turning a small object over and over in his calloused fingers. A rusted dog collar, bent and partially broken, with remnants of a torn nylon strap and a metal tag that no longer bore any name. What caught his attention, however, was the tiny socket where a microchip had clearly once been inserted and just as clearly had been forcibly removed. The base of the collar showed scratch marks, deep and erratic, like someone had pried it out in a hurry. He glanced toward the hearth. Hank was awake, lying quietly by the fire, his amber eyes tracking Caleb with tired curiosity. The dog had eaten some of the chicken Eliza had brought the night before, and his breathing was more even. But it was clear now Hank hadn't just wandered off from some nearby farm. Someone had erased his identity. After making sure Hank was resting comfortably, Caleb bundled up and stepped outside. The snow was crusted over from the sun's brief heat yesterday, and his boots crunched as he made his way to the main road. Cell service was patchy in Northwood's forest basin, so he walked a mile to the ranger station off Route 5. It was a squat wooden building with a metal roof and a small antenna poking through the pines. Inside, Deputy Reese Anders looked up from his paperwork. Reese was in his mid-40s, with the tired frame of a man who'd been too long in a small town with too many quiet crimes. He had a square jaw, dark stubble, and wore his uniform like it was just another coat. Reese had known Caleb before Daniel's death, when the two used to fish together on weekends. Morning, Caleb. Didn't expect to see you, he said, straightening slightly. I found a dog, Caleb said, holding out the collar. German Shepherd, big, male, wounded. Looks trained. This was on him. Reese took the collar, his brow tightening. Damn, this looks wrong. There's no chip, Caleb added. But there was one. Reese studied the metal, then walked to his desk and pulled a manila folder from a stack. He flipped through several pages before pausing. There's a case you should hear about. 2 weeks ago, we had an incident near the Canada Border Animal Control, raided a site suspected of running illegal dog fights. They found cages, blood, and remnants of tagging chips. The place was torched before they could gather full evidence. We believe someone tipped them off. Caleb's stomach turned. Dog fights. Yeah, some of the dogs were recovered, but several escaped. One matching your description. Black and tan shepherd, male, about 5 years old, very protective. They called him Ace, I think. Ace, Caleb repeated, eyes narrowing. He goes by Hank now. Reese gave a weary smile. Better name. Can you check if he's listed as dangerous? I will, Reese said, nodding. But if he came to you for help and you're still standing, I'd say he chose peace. Most fighting dogs don't last out in the cold. The ones that do, they're different. Caleb thanked him and walked back slowly, thoughts churning. He looked at the landscape around him, the serene, frozen wilderness. The same forest that had sheltered him in his grief now might have also saved this dog's life. Perhaps that meant something. Back at the cabin, Hank lifted his head as Caleb entered. His ears twitched. Caleb sat beside him and stroked his coarse fur gently. "You've seen hell, haven't you?" he murmured. "Well, you're out of it now." That afternoon, Eliza returned, her cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a large paper bag and her sketchbook. "I brought beef stew this time," she announced, "and I got something to show you." She set the bag down, pulled out her sketchbook, and flipped to a page filled with Hank's likenesses. There was Hank sleeping, Hank curled near the fire, Hank looking out the window, one ear raised. Her drawings were vivid and expressive, each capturing not just his shape, but his spirit. "I want to enter these in the Winter Arts Contest," she said, voice full of hope. "Theme is Hope in the Heart of Winter." I thought, he's perfect. Caleb raised his eyebrows. "You're serious?" Eliza nodded. "We have to submit by next week. I was going to draw snowy trees or some boring deer. But Hank, he's better. He's a survivor." Caleb looked at Hank. The dog tilted his head slightly as if understanding. "I don't have much to enter," Eliza added, her tone shifting. "Most kids in school have fancy supplies. Mine are all from garage sales." "You've got something they don't," Caleb said. "You've got heart. That's worth more." Eliza flushed with pride and handed him a small envelope. "Can you mail it for me? I don't want to ask my parents. They'll say it's silly." He nodded, taking it gently. The envelope was labeled Winter Arts, Submission, Eliza Monroe. Inside were 3 carefully cut pages of her drawings and a handwritten artist statement. Caleb tucked it into his coat. "I'll take care of it." Later that night, after Eliza had left, Caleb stood by the fire with a letter in hand. He had retrieved Daniel's old military journal from a chest earlier, a book filled with sketches, notes, and pieces of his son's heart. There, tucked in a sleeve, had been an old photo of Daniel kneeling beside Max, his German shepherd. The same eyes, same stance, same loyalty Caleb saw now in Hank. The resemblance was uncanny. He whispered aloud, "Maybe you didn't come here by accident, Hank." The dog let out a soft breath, a sound that was neither whine nor sigh, something in between. It made Caleb feel for the first time in a long while that maybe the pieces of his life were rearranging themselves towards something whole again. The wind that night was soft, not screaming like during the storm, but whispering across the eaves of the cabin, brushing against the windows like cold fingers seeking entry. Outside, Northwood lay still beneath a deep coat of snow. Moonlight touched the fields like powdered glass. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows that moved like thoughts across the walls. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, boots half-laced, listening. The sound had become familiar now. It started soft, a low whimper, then the twitch of paws, then a sharp yelp that pulled Caleb fully awake. Hank lay curled near the hearth, his legs kicking slightly as if running in his sleep. A strangled whine escaped his throat. Caleb crossed the room quietly and knelt beside the dog, laying a steady hand on Hank's shoulder. The muscle beneath trembled. "It's okay, boy," he whispered. "You're here. You're safe." Hank's eyes opened slowly, unfocused, then sharpened as he recognized Caleb. He let out a quiet, exhausted sigh and pressed his head against the man's hand. Caleb sat there for a long while, stroking the dog's side until the tremors subsided. It wasn't the first night Hank had cried in his sleep, and it wouldn't be the last. The nightmares, Caleb knew, didn't always fade when daylight came. He had lived with them too. After Daniel's death, Caleb had spent months reliving the day the officers came to his door. Over and over again, the knock, the flag, the silence afterward that stretched into years. In his mind, Daniel's voice had become distant, distorted like a memory trying to disappear. Some nights, he would wake drenched in sweat, haunted by images he'd never even witnessed. That's what grief does. It fills in the blanks with terror. That night, instead of returning to his own bed, Caleb dragged an old wool blanket from the closet and laid it near the fire. He lay down beside Hank, not close enough to startle him, but near enough that their breathing shared the same rhythm. For the first time in months, sleep came to Caleb in slow, even waves. In the morning, the cabin smelled of wet fur and coffee. Hank had risen early and was sitting at the front door, head tilted toward the glass. The snow had fallen again, light but steady, and the pine trees wore fresh coats of white. Eliza arrived around mid-morning, her scarf trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She burst in with her usual energy, cheeks flushed and eyes dancing. "I brought something," she declared. Caleb raised a brow. "Another sketch? Better." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a laminated flyer. "Winter Arts Contest finalists announced today. Guess who made the top 10? Caleb took the flyer and scanned it. Eliza's name was printed in bold under the Youth Category Finalists heading, right next to the title of her piece, Stillness and Survival, a Winter Portrait. There was even a thumbnail print of her sketch of Hank, the one where he gazed into the fire, half his face illuminated in gold. "You did it," Caleb said, a rare smile pulling at his lips. "I know," she grinned. "They said I get to present the piece in town. Real gallery, real audience. There's even going to be a local reporter." Caleb's smile faded slightly at that. "A reporter?" "Just small town stuff," she said. "They want to write about young hope in hard winters. I said Hank was my inspiration. They want to meet him." Caleb glanced toward Hank, who now lay sprawled comfortably near the window. His fur had started to grow back where the wounds had scabbed. The haunted look in his eyes wasn't gone, but it had softened. Caleb wasn't sure how the dog would react to crowds, lights, strangers. "Maybe we wait on that part," he said gently. Eliza seemed to understand. She lowered her voice. "I just thought, people should see what healing looks like." Caleb nodded. "They should, but healing's slow. Not everything's ready to be seen." Later that day, they all sat near the fire again, Eliza doodling new sketches, Hank sleeping with his nose tucked under his paw, Caleb working on a block of wood with a whittling knife. It was the first time in over a year he'd touched a carving tool. "What are you making?" Eliza asked. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but it'll tell me soon." As the afternoon wore on, Eliza asked, "Do you ever miss talking to people? Like, real talking?" Caleb paused. His fingers rested against the soft curve he'd just shaped. "I used to think talking made things worse. That silence was safer. But now, I'm not so sure." Eliza smiled, satisfied with that answer. That evening, as Caleb swept the porch, he saw someone walking up the drive, a woman, tall and slender, wrapped in a long gray coat and wearing thick boots. Her walk was brisk but not rushed. She carried a thermos in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "Hello there," she called, her voice warm but authoritative. Caleb stepped down from the porch. "Can I help you?" She smiled and removed her knit cap. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a low bun, and her face, though lined with age, held clear, intelligent eyes. "Name's Marla Devine. I work with the Vermont Rescue and Rehabilitation Program for Animals. Heard you found a shepherd with no ID?" Caleb tensed. "Who told you that?" "Local vet," she replied calmly. "And someone at the ranger station. I'm not here to take him, just here to talk." Caleb studied her. Marla looked to be in her late 50s, with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime doing work that mattered. Her coat bore faint scratches, and her boots had patches where seams had been repaired. She looked like someone who didn't back away from hard things. He nodded slowly and led her inside. When Marla saw Hank, she crouched gently a few feet away. "Hello, boy," she said softly. Hank looked at her, ears low but not fearful. She didn't reach out, just watched him with eyes that had clearly seen 1,000 strays and survivors. "He trusts you," she said, glancing at Caleb. Caleb gave a brief nod. "He came here on his own." Marla smiled. "They always know where the light is." They spoke quietly for the next half hour. Marla explained she wasn't part of animal control, but worked with post-trauma canines dogs rescued from rings, violence, and abandonment. Her program partnered with veterans, therapy groups, even art centers. "You'd be surprised how often animals and people need the same thing," she said. "A warm place and someone who doesn't expect them to be whole right away." Before she left, she handed Caleb a card. "I won't report anything, but if you ever feel like sharing his story, maybe even yours, my line's open." That night, Hank didn't cry. He slept soundly beside the fire, and Caleb slept nearby again, his dreams quieter, his breathing deeper. The cabin no longer felt like a place to hide. It felt like a place slowly remembering how to hold life again. The sun rose bright and clear over Northwood, casting long shadows across the crusted snow that blanketed the forest. For the first time in days, the wind had calmed, and a deceptive stillness hung over the land. Inside Caleb's cabin, warmth curled from the fireplace like a sleepy cat, drifting through the room where Hank dozed peacefully by the hearth. Eliza had arrived earlier with her sketchpad and a thermos of tomato soup. She sat cross-legged on the rug, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth, as she refined her newest drawing. Hank standing sentinel by the front porch, framed in winter light. "I think I'll title this one Watchman," she murmured, glancing up. "Because that's what he is, isn't he?" Caleb, seated at the table carving the beginnings of what might become a hawk in flight, gave a soft chuckle. "You're not wrong." Hank, as if hearing his name, lifted his head. His ears twitched, then rose sharply. He stood, sniffed the air, and padded to the door with unusual urgency. His body stiffened. Caleb frowned. "What is it, boy?" Hank growled low, not in aggression, but in alert. Then he barked a deep, urgent sound and pawed at the door. Eliza stood quickly. "He wants out." The moment Caleb opened the door, Hank bolted into the snow-covered yard, his nose to the ground, tail held low and stiff. Caleb barely had time to throw on his coat before following, Eliza scrambling behind him, breathless with curiosity and concern. They followed Hank into the woods behind the cabin, the path crunching beneath their boots. The sun blinked through bare branches, dappling the snow in gold and silver. Hank led them without hesitation, weaving through drifts and under low-hanging limbs with the precision of an animal on a mission. Caleb's heart pounded, not from exertion, but from the strange intensity radiating from Hank's every move. About 20 minutes into the forest, they heard it, a faint whimpering sound, muffled and intermittent. Eliza stopped in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" Caleb nodded, his breath visible in the cold. "This way." Hank picked up speed, skidding slightly as he reached a clearing near a steep dip in the landscape. At the bottom of a shallow ravine, nearly hidden beneath bent pine boughs, sat a battered gray pickup truck, half buried in snow. One of its tires was sunken in deep ice. The back windows were frosted over. Caleb could just make out movement inside. "Oh my God," Eliza whispered. "Is that—" They scrambled down the embankment. Caleb wrenched open the truck's front door, empty save for a crumpled fast food bag and scattered tools. He moved to the rear and, with Hank pacing beside him, pulled at the latch of the covered truck bed. The door creaked open. Inside, in a battered metal crate, were two puppies, German Shepherd mixes, likely no more than 10 weeks old. One was black and tan, trembling violently. The other was pale gold, curled tightly against its sibling. Their water dish was frozen solid. A chewed bag of kibble lay shredded in one corner, almost empty. "They've been here for days," Caleb muttered, heart twisting. Eliza reached in without hesitation. "They're freezing. We have to get them out." The puppies were too weak to resist. Caleb wrapped them in his scarf and coat, one each, and handed one to Eliza. She cradled the tiny gold one close to her chest. "You're so small," she whispered. "We're going to fix this." As they climbed back toward the path, Caleb turned to Hank. "You found them. You knew." Hank's tail swayed once in quiet affirmation. Then he moved beside Eliza, as if guarding her and the pup. Back at the cabin, the next hours blurred into a rush of hot towels, warm water, and slow feeding. Caleb cleaned out an old laundry basket, lined it with quilts, and placed the puppies inside near the fire. Hank sat close, eyes never leaving the makeshift cradle. Eliza called her parents from Caleb's landline, explaining everything. Her mother, a schoolteacher named Ray Monroe, soon arrived in a flurry of concern and winter layers. Ray was a practical woman in her early 40s, with a quick mind and tired eyes that softened when she saw the puppies. Tall and slim, her brunette hair was streaked with gray at the temples from years of teaching and raising 4 children. Though often reserved, her voice wavered as she gently pet the pups. "This one looks like a shadow," she said softly. "The other's like sun." "Shadow and Sunny," Eliza declared. "That's what I'm calling them." Ray nodded toward Caleb. "Thank you for calling. I didn't realize how much time Eliza spent here. She brings color into the quiet, Caleb replied simply. That night, Eliza posted a picture online, Hank sitting beside the rescued puppies, firelight glowing behind them. She captioned it, "Hero of the woods, Hank saved 2 lives today." By morning, the photo had been shared over 100 times. By evening, the local paper called. Then, the regional news. A reporter named Kent Hawley visited the next day, tall and balding, with a voice like a warm radio tune. He interviewed Caleb outside the cabin while Hank sat stoically by his feet. "What made the dog react that way?" Kent asked. "I think he heard what we didn't," Caleb replied. "Or maybe he remembered what it felt like to be forgotten." The headline the next day read, "Forest Dog Rescues Puppies from Abandoned Truck." Below it, a photo of Hank with one paw resting protectively over Sonny. People began to refer to him as Northwood's 4-legged guardian. Marla Devine returned that weekend with supplies, blankets, deworming kits, and small collars. "You've got quite the crew now," she said, smiling at the puppies as they toddled around the hearth. "They're healing," Caleb said. "So are you," she added. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it. That night, as Hank lay with the pups nestled against his belly, Caleb sat back in his armchair, the soft sounds of puppy breathing filling the space. He glanced out the window. Snow still covered the world, but inside, warmth moved like a current between them. All man, dog, and the next generation of lives quietly being saved. The town hall of Northwood wasn't a grand building, just a weathered structure with cedar shingles and a squeaky wooden floor. But that day, it was filled with light, laughter, and the rustling of folding chairs. The community had gathered for the annual Winter Hope Forum, usually a modest event about local wildlife and conservation. But this year, it had a different centerpiece, a retired German shepherd named Hank, and the story of 2 rescued puppies that had swept through the county like a thaw in spring. Caleb Moore sat stiffly in the second row, a fresh blue flannel shirt tucked into his jeans, the collar pressed neatly, though he'd spent 10 minutes adjusting it before leaving the cabin. He hadn't stood in front of an audience since Daniel's funeral. Even the thought of it made his palms sweat. But when the town council asked him to speak, Eliza had looked up at him with those hopeful eyes and said, "If Hank can be brave, so can you." And so here he was, seated beside Eliza, who wore her best corduroy skirt, wool tights, and a lopsided braid. Her cheeks were pink with excitement and nerves. In her lap sat a rolled canvas with her winning artwork, tied with a golden ribbon. Hank lay at their feet, calm and dignified, a red bandana tied around his neck. The room buzzed with anticipation. At the back stood Marla Devine, wearing a thick wool coat and a knowing smile. She nodded gently at Caleb, and he returned a small, grateful nod. Shadow and Sonny weren't far. They had been adopted by 2 vetted local families, but both had been brought back today to reunite with Hank. The pups, now healthier and more energetic, wrestled gently in the corner under a sign that read, "Thank you, Hank." The mayor, a portly man named Arthur Bell, known for his rosy cheeks and slow, deliberate speech, stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, clearing his throat, "this year's Winter Hope Forum is not just about surviving the season, but about remembering how small acts of kindness can change everything. This town owes a great deal to a dog, a man, and a girl with a sketchbook." There was gentle laughter and applause. Then he gestured toward Caleb. "Mr. Moore, would you join us?" Caleb rose slowly, adjusting his sleeves. The room grew quieter. He stepped up to the podium, glanced at Eliza for reassurance, then looked out at the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces, neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years, children from Eliza's school, even a few local officers from the sheriff's department. "I never thought I'd be back here," he began, voice raspy but steady. "When I lost my son, I shut everything out. People, places, even the things I loved. I retreated into silence because it was easier than facing what I couldn't change." He paused. Hank shifted beside him, tail gently brushing the stage. Then this dog appeared, wounded, frozen, like something from a memory I'd buried too deep, and suddenly, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Caleb spoke of Hank's rescue, the puppies, and how a young girl's pencil sketches brought light back into their lives. He didn't speak like a practiced orator, but like a man telling the truth for the first time in years. When he finished, the applause was quiet but full, the kind that came from understanding rather than noise. Afterward, Eliza was called to the stage. She stood shyly, clutching her canvas, her boots barely making sound on the wooden floor. The announcer, a librarian named Ms. Clark Tall, elegant, always wrapped in a scarf, read Eliza's artist statement aloud. It spoke of Hank, of what it meant to draw hope, of how quiet heroes didn't need capes, only courage and a second chance. When Eliza unrolled the painting, there was a collective hush. It showed Hank in the woods, standing between two trees, eyes bright, body worn but proud. Behind him, barely visible in charcoal lines, was the silhouette of Daniel kneeling, hand outstretched. Caleb's breath caught. Eliza had never met his son, but she had seen his photo on the mantel and drawn him from memory and imagination. Caleb put a hand over his chest. It wasn't grief this time. It was something gentler, like permission to remember without pain. That evening, back at the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Caleb sat with Hank curled beside him, the red bandana still tied proudly. Eliza had gone home with her parents, her painting already hanging in the town library. On the table lay a letter from the Vermont K-9 Honor Registry. Hank, former Search and Rescue Unit, status, retired with honors. Inside the envelope was a certificate, faded records showing Hank had once been a rescue dog deployed after wildfires in California. He had gone missing during transport between assignments and was presumed dead until now. Caleb stared at the document. "You were never lost," he said softly to Hank, "just waiting to be found again." Outside, snow fell lightly, blanketing the trees, but the cabin pulsed with warmth. For the first time in years, the darkness didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something bright. Spring came to Northwood not with fanfare, but in quiet thaws and shy green buds pressing through old snow. The trees shed their icy coats, and the sun lingered a little longer each day. Along the cabin's eaves, icicles melted into rivulets, and birdsong missing for so long returned to the silence like long-lost notes of a forgotten melody. Inside the cabin, the change was even more profound. Where once there had been only the crackle of fire and the creak of wood settling, now there were soft barks, light paws skittering across the floor, and laughter, the kind that came from surprise, from affection, from homecoming. Caleb Moore stood by the wood stove, finishing the last smooth curve of a carving. It had taken him weeks, working between feeding times, walks, and vet checkups, but now the shape was clear and full of life. A German shepherd mid-step, ears alert, gaze proud. It was Hank, immortalized in maple. The statue stood roughly 2 feet tall, mounted on a reclaimed cedar base with the name Hank Guardian engraved at the bottom in simple, hand-burned letters. He placed it on the mantel beside an old photograph of Daniel, the two side by side, not in mourning now, but in memory. Hank lay on the rug, watching with tired but contented eyes. His fur had grown back to full thickness, dark and sleek, with just a few silvered streaks around the muzzle. His old wounds had long healed, and so had others. Deeper, invisible ones that had kept him distant. He no longer flinched at sudden movement or slept with one eye open. He had begun to rest like a dog who knew he belonged. 2 feet away, Dusty pounced on a rolled-up sock, growling with delight. The small shepherd mix originally called Sonny, now renamed, had become Eliza's new best friend and constant shadow. At 3 months old, Dusty had big paws she hadn't yet grown into, a golden coat like wheat at dusk, and one ear that always flopped sideways no matter how determined she looked. She was all mischief and boundless affection. Eliza arrived just after lunch, as she always did on Saturdays. Today she wore a denim jacket layered over a purple hoodie, jeans smeared with a bit of chalk dust from her art class, and sneakers she'd outgrown but refused to throw away. She let herself in, Dusty bounding behind her, leash dragging like an afterthought. "Guess who learned to sit?" she called. Caleb looked up from the counter where he was mixing sourdough starter. "You or the dog?" "Both," she grinned. But she did it first. Dusty ran straight to Hank, yipping, and the older dog raised his head just enough to acknowledge her before letting it fall back onto his front paws, tolerant and amused. Hank had taken to the puppy with surprising grace, often letting her chew his tail, steal his spot by the fire, or nap across his back like a blanket. "I think she believes he's her dad," Eliza whispered, kneeling beside them. Caleb watched the two dogs for a moment before nodding. Maybe he is. Or something close. That evening, Caleb sat down with paperwork spread across the kitchen table. The adoption forms were already approved. He had officially registered Hank as his own, not just as a pet, but as a senior working dog under retired service status. It was the final, quiet step of a decision long made. Marla had helped expedite everything. "He chose you first," she'd said simply when they spoke last. "You're just following his lead now." The rescue center had also successfully rehomed Shadow, the black and tan, pup to a couple in Burlington with 2 young boys in a fenced backyard. Caleb received regular pictures. The pup playing fetch, riding shotgun on weekend errands, sleeping curled between the children's feet during movie nights. Now, the cabin was not just a home again. It was a place where life happened. Caleb had moved his carving bench to the window, where natural light poured in. He even reopened commissions quietly, taking orders from a nearby co-op gallery. Word had gotten out that the reclusive woodcarver from the woods was back. Late that night, after Eliza had gone home, Caleb stood at the back porch with a mug of tea. The stars shimmered above the dark trees, and Hank stepped up beside him. No leash, no command. Just 2 companions breathing the same quiet. "You found me," Caleb said, staring at the night. "And I didn't know I needed to be found." Hank looked up briefly, his tail sweeping across the porch. "You ready to stay for good?" The dog nudged his leg gently and sat down, watching the trees as if standing guard. Inside, Dusty chased her own tail until she collapsed, legs sprawled like a starfish. Caleb smiled and shut the door softly. Everything had changed, not in one grand moment, but in thousands of small ones. A paw pressing into his knee, a half-finished sketch by the hearth, the glow of a wooden statue that hadn't been there before. It was a new family, not perfect, not whole in the old ways, but real and quietly resilient. The last of the snow melted in hushed retreat, seeping into the softening earth and revealing patches of moss, old leaves, and tiny green shoots that curled like hope toward the sunlight. The forest around Northwood stirred with the subtle life of spring, the chirping of newly returned birds, the gentle rustle of awakening branches, the distant babble of a creek once frozen silent. The world, it seemed, had taken a long breath and was finally beginning to exhale. Inside the cabin, morning light spilled through the windows, catching dust motes in its golden fingers. On the kitchen table lay a worn leather-bound journal, its cover faded with time and use. Caleb Moore sat in his usual chair, pen in hand, writing steadily in long, looping strokes. His handwriting wasn't elegant, but it was steady, each word a deliberate act, each sentence a memory preserved. He titled the front page, "The Shelter in the Storm." The story that followed was not a dramatic memoir, but something gentler, an account of grief, healing, and unexpected companionship. Caleb wrote of the night Hank appeared like a ghost at his door, wounded and silent. He wrote of Eliza, the girl with fire in her sketches and laughter in her shoes, of the pups, Shadow and Dusty, of the slow, almost imperceptible way a life once hollow had begun to fill again, not with what had been lost, but with something new. The journal wasn't for publication, not yet. It was for the local library, for the kids in town who might one day feel alone, and for the grown-ups too, those who bore invisible bruises. It was for the ones who'd lost and stayed silent. Caleb believed now that stories could shelter people just as surely as cabins did in winter storms. Outside, Dusty barked playful, high-pitched, a sound of energy barely contained. Caleb looked up and smiled. Through the front window, he saw her tumbling across the yard, chasing a squirrel with all the enthusiasm of a dog who believed the chase itself was the reward. Hank stood nearby, regal and calm, his eyes following Dusty with what could only be described as affectionate bemusement. His coat shone in the morning light, the silver near his muzzle a soft contrast to the black and tan of his frame. Eliza arrived just after lunch, a small satchel slung across her shoulder and a sheaf of papers poking out the top. She wore her hair loose today, her curls bouncing with every step, and a denim jacket covered in patches. Each one hand-sewn, each telling its own story. She looked older than she had that winter morning, when she first knocked on Caleb's door. Not in age, but in spirit, stronger, more assured. "I brought the prints," she said, holding up her folder. "Ms. Clark wants to make a display at the library. My sketches, your wood carving, and maybe the story." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You want to share it?" Eliza nodded. "Everyone knows parts of it. I think they'd like to know the heart of it, too. They spent the afternoon assembling what would become the town's spring exhibit, Hope in the Heart of Winter. There were drawings of Hank in motion, Dusty mid-leap, and even a soft, solemn rendering of Daniel beside Max, based on a photo Eliza had borrowed for reference. The centerpiece would be Caleb's statue of Hank, now mounted on a stained pine base with the new engraving, "Shelter is more than a roof." As they worked, Ray Monroe stopped by, bringing fresh banana bread wrapped in a towel still warm from the oven. Ray, always neatly dressed and brisk in her movements, had softened considerably since that bitter January day. She stayed for coffee, sitting beside the stove while the dogs dozed and the scent of cinnamon filled the room. "I see your door stays open more now," she remarked. "Spring does that," Caleb replied. "No," she smiled, "you do that." That night, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting everything in lavender and gold, Caleb closed the journal and slipped it into a wooden box he'd carved long ago, originally meant for keepsakes that had remained empty for too long. Now, it held memories once buried and the story of a dog who'd walked out of a storm and into a life. "I think he saved me," Caleb whispered to the fire. Hank lifted his head at the sound and patted over, resting it against Caleb's leg. The next morning, they walked. Eliza, Caleb, Hank, and Dusty followed the winding trail that led through the thawing woods, past old deer tracks and snowdrops blooming defiantly through the melt. Eliza tossed a stick for Dusty, who leapt after it with uncoordinated joy, while Hank trotted beside Caleb, shoulder to knee. The sun was warm now, not just light, but heat, and the road ahead, still a bit muddy, still unsure, stretched out into a season not yet defined. But they walked it together. Not as a man and his dog, not as a girl and her drawing pad, but as a family, a shelter in each other's hearts. Here's the lesson this story leaves behind. Sometimes the shelter we think we're giving to others is the one we truly need ourselves. In everyday life, we often rush past those quiet moments. A stranger's glance, a dog's silent plea, a child's drawing. But healing doesn't always come loud. It arrives in small, patient steps. If this story touched something in you, please share it with someone who needs warmth today, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. And one more thing, if you had to name your own shelter in the storm, what would it be? Let us know in the comments below.